So in the 80s, 90s, early 2000s, I want to see if you agree or disagree with this thesis. It
Okay.
seemed like most of what we did was say white, black, Asian, and Hispanic. We may look different, but we actually are far more in common, even though our identities may appear different. In other
Okay.
words, that seemed to be the culture that existed. And I was very optimistic that people were getting along better. And I
Mhm.
don't know exactly when that shifted, but it seems to me that the rise of what I call identity politics, and I know we talked about this last
Mhm.
time on
Mhm.
your show, which is
Yes.
to me that your identity defines what you believe, i.e., you're a
Mhm.
black man, so it's expected that you're going to believe X, Y, and Z. I'm a
Right.
white guy in the South, so I should believe X, Y, and Z. When the
Right.
reality is, both of us and everybody out there listening to us too is far more complicated and interesting than whatever your physical identity might be. And that it is therefore this idea that we're all primarily defined by the things we don't control, by the
Mhm.
choices we don't make, as opposed to, as you said, I mean, I think everybody who's listened to us talk over the course of this show is going to have
Mhm.
a different opinion of you than they had before. I think a more
Mhm.
favorable one, as typically happens when a conversation takes place. So I
Mm.
think we have to break identity politics and stop looking at someone primarily as their race or their gender or their sexuality as a defining characteristic. And I think
Well,
that's
that's one
what
way.
has led us apart. That's my
That's
thesis.
one way. That's one way to look at it. Let me tell you where I feel differently. As a black man, my experiences are different than you in this country. One of the things that I'm very popular for saying to white America is if I call somebody a racist bastard or a no good bastard with prejudice sifting through their soul or whatever, if that's not you, I'm not talking about you. I'm talking about those people who are that way, not white people. I'm talking about those people, those individuals, those characteristics that I highlighted. What you have is a situation where you can look at identity politics in a slightly different way than me. You just articulated where you're coming from. You know what I would also call identity politics, Clay? Somebody that automatically assumes they have to jump on the bandwagon and support the person that I just excoriated, classifying them the way that they did, as if I'm talking about them when I wasn't. If it doesn't identify with you and you have nothing to do with such a characterization, why are you being defensive? I'm not talking about you. I'm talking about those people who conduct themselves that way. Take this into account, Clay. During the civil rights era, there were black folks fighting and marching and putting their lives on the line for civil rights. I recall seeing white people out there fighting with them. There were some white people
Right.
out there fighting with them, putting their lives on the line, fighting for civil rights for black people. Everybody that's white ain't evil. Everybody that's black ain't good. Okay. So we got to understand that and take it to that point. But here's where I would really differ from you. You talked about identity politics. I got something 10 times more damaging: woke culture.
Yeah.
It ain't popular to say it's woke culture. Here's why woke culture is worse. Because no matter what your identity is or what my identity is, we can live in our separate worlds or we could choose to come together. Woke get you fired if you ain't woke enough, if you don't
Yeah.
agree with what the woke culture says it wants you to agree with. And so what happens is somebody like me, Clay Travis, might say 10 things I disagree with, but 9 of them I have no problem with. Now, if I have a problem with something, I'll say so. But the other 9 things you said, I'm like, wait a minute. He might feel differently than me, but it's perfectly within his right to say that. It's perfectly within his right to feel that way. He said absolutely nothing wrong. Why are you trying to get him fired? And then here's where it comes. I'm looking at Clay on the right, but I see Bill Maher on the left. I was at Club Random in Hollywood talking to Bill Maher on his podcast for 2 hours. Okay. His politics don't identify with Clay, but listening to the both of them, I don't see that big of a difference in terms of their belief in freedom of speech, freedom of
Yep.
expression, having the right to say what you feel as long as it comes from a cogent and substantive place. There's no problem with it. Who said we have to disagree? If Clay Travis invited me on this show and we talked politics for 2 hours, I'm quite sure we would disagree on a few things. You know what you wouldn't get from me? Offensiveness. I wouldn't be offended by what you're thinking. I told you
Yeah.
I'm cool with Sean Hannity. I told you I'm cool with Mark Levin. I can assure you, they both know 65 to 75% of the time, I think they're off their rocker. But you know something? They know what they're talking about. They're firm with what they believe. And at their core, they're decent human beings. And I'm good with that. They get a little wild sometimes, especially Mark Levin, because he's so dogged about the Constitution and everything. Don't get me started with him. But I respect the hell out of them. What's wrong with it? We got to grow up as a society and accept the fact that differences are okay as long as we're wishing the best for our fellow men and women, and we're not using every little excuse that we can to end somebody's career. Because I've made mistakes. You've made mistakes. We all have. But my God, should we lose our careers for it? I don't agree with that at all. And I think woke culture has instigated that kind of thinking. And that's why when you've spoken about woke culture, I've sat up there and said to people, he's right. He's right.
I just think the idea of firing anybody because you don't like their opinion, oftentimes on a show that is based on opinions, like Whoopi Goldberg got suspended on The View for sharing her opinion. I'm like, I know you've gotten suspended before. Almost everybody in media, it feels like, who has strong opinions has gotten suspended for saying things that they actually believe. And I just think it's wrong, right? Like, you can agree or disagree. Let people react. It's crazy.
It's wrong. It's wrong, but I've told you this on my show, and I'll tell you this to your audience right now. The only thing that I would ask an abundance of people on the right, including yourself, is that be sensitive and appreciative of the platform you have, because you can afford to disagree and keep your job. There are a lot of people that'll lose their jobs for saying a lot of the things that you guys say, most of which I have no problem with. Okay.
Yep.
It's just the way that we live. And so if you have somebody and they're working under an umbrella where you have those kind of restrictions, okay, then what's the greater good here? I might need to be quiet about this because I'm about to roar about that. And the thing that I'm about to roar about is going to affect millions of lives. This one right here ain't going to affect folks so much, so it's not that big a deal. You make those judicious decisions sometimes depending on who you work for. Then we got advertisers and sponsors. Okay, yeah, you can say what you want, but we ain't going to spend our money on this platform because we don't like what you said. And so you got to be sensitive to what they said. Now, guys will acknowledge, well, they just got to be sensitive because the advertiser would have let them go or their job would have let them go. But then they're insulted for that. Well, wait a minute. If they don't have a job waiting for them and they got bills to pay, all I have to do for these next 15 minutes is shut the hell up and not say anything about this issue, you live to fight another day. In life, we make those decisions all the time. There's nothing wrong with that when that's the reason. But there is a level of fearlessness that you have to have in this industry. People like me have it, you have it, and others. But it took us a while. I mean, it didn't take us too long to get there. We understood what it is. We understood what we were going to be. But we also are smart enough to know where the true minefields lie. And there's always minefields that you have to avoid, even in our profession.